So back with the fourth and final part of my Fixing Faulty eBay Junk series here, and it's been a few days since I've had a chance to work on this, but if you watched the last video you'll have seen that I was able to determine that the fault was with either the GPU or the CPU and a bad connection between the motherboard. And I did that by unplugging the fans here and overheating the console. And I just want to stress that unplugging the fans and overheating your console is just a really temporary fix, and you should only really do it just to find out where the fault is with your console. It's definitely not going to be a long-lasting repair. It might last a few minutes, it might last a few hours, and in some cases you might get your console up and running again for a couple of weeks, but it's definitely not a permanent fix. So I'll go over some of the solutions you've got for repairing this and getting a reasonably reliable fix, but I just wanted to point that out. Unplugging your fans and overheating your console is not advisable in the first place, but it's definitely not a long-term fix, and you should only really use it for finding out where the fault is with a console. So what I'm going to be doing next is taking the motherboard out of here, flipping it over and adjusting the X clamps that are on here. There are a few different versions, or there's a few different options available to you, and I'll go over those in just a minute, but the way I'm going to be fixing this particular console is I'm going to be adjusting the tension of the X clamps that are already in place. And I was actually able to determine that the particular fault on this console is with the GPU, and I was able to do that by applying pressure at different points on the heatsink here. And like I was saying, the overheating the console to get rid of the 3 red lights of death is only a temporary fix. And after, I think it was after literally 20 minutes, the red ring of death reappeared with this console. So I was then able to apply pressure points to the GPU and just test if that was the fault. And sure enough, by pressing down at the rear of the heatsink here and turning the console on, it would get rid of the red lights of death. So I'm now able to determine that this particular console, the problem is with the pressure of the heatsink on the GPU, or there's not enough pressure on it. So I'll be addressing that in just a moment. So if we turn the motherboard upside down, you'll see the X clamps underneath, and that's these things here. And those are what I'm going to be adjusting to try and get a reliable fix and get rid of the 3 red lights of death. And there are several different options available to you for repairing these old faulty consoles. And in an ideal world, what you'd really want to be doing is getting it professionally reflowed. And what that involves is using specialist equipment to basically take up or lift off the GPU and the CPU chips and adding new solder to them and then reflowing them back to the motherboard. But the problem with that is it requires specialist equipment, which is really expensive. And if you want to pay someone to do it for you, then again you're talking probably quite a lot of money. So I mean, with the likes of this, I've only paid £14 for it. It wouldn't really make much sense to throw a whole load of money at it when I could probably just go out and buy like either a new slim model or second-hand model for probably less or about the same money. So the other options available to you are kind of Homebrew Solutions. So what a lot of people like to do is get a heat gun and heat the motherboard up themselves. Sometimes people refer to that as like a kind of a homebrew version of reflowing, and you're basically heating up the chips and trying to melt the solder and get that connection back again. But really I wouldn't recommend that at all, because what you'll probably end up doing is damaging the motherboard, and you're not really reflowing the solder, you're only really warping the motherboard, and basically you're going to end up damaging things doing that. So I wouldn't recommend using a heat gun to try and do a homemade kind of reflow. It might work for a short period, but in the long term it's not really going to fix the problem. So another really popular solution is to completely remove the X clamp altogether and replace it with machine screws like these here. Use washers as well as spacers, and what that will allow you to do is put a lot more pressure on the heat sinks above the motherboard, and you can also adjust the tension in the 4 corners separately. And that's a really reliable solution. It will get your console most of the time back up and running again. The only downside is it can end up putting pressure on other parts of the motherboard you didn't really want. pressure to be applied to, and you'll find that you'll constantly be readjusting the tension in the screws every couple of weeks or months. It is a good solution. I've used it many times before, and most of the time it will work. It will eventually fail again though, so just bear that in mind. It will probably last you a few weeks, a few months, but again, in the long run, it won't completely fix the problem. The only way to really fix the problem is to do the proper reflow, like I said before, but that's just another option available to you. So those are just some of the different ways you can repair the 3 red lights of death error, but for this particular Xbox I'm going to be using a slightly different method, and all I'll be doing is adjusting the tension in the X clamps that are already in place. So to do that, I'll just pop off the X clamp from the bottom of the motherboard, and I'll simply bend these arms back very slightly. And what that'll do is it'll put more tension into the X clamp, and in turn that'll pull everything closer together. So it'll pull the heatsink above closer to the motherboard and keep everything just a bit tighter. I'll also be fitting some nylon washers, and I use nylon washers like these here. And the good thing about nylon washers is that they allow for some movement. So when the motherboard heats up and cools down, there's some obviously expansion and contraction going on. So you want to allow for just this tiny bit of movement between the motherboard and the X clamp. And as you can see here, I've already fitted them to the GPU clamping system here. Just make that out. And I'll do the same for the CPU here as well. And after I've done that, I'll also do a bit of a fan shroud mod to improve the cooling over the heat sinks. I've also fitted some of these, and these are thermal pads, and they just sit on top of the RAM on the underside of the motherboard and help draw heat away from the chips. So next thing I'll do is I'll fit that other X clamp and put everything back together again and do the fan shroud mod. So the clamps have been adjusted and I've put pretty much everything back together again now. I've also done the fan shroud mod, and if you don't know what that is, I'll leave a link in the description below. But basically all you're doing is getting some cardboard like this here, some tape, and taping extra sections onto the fan shroud. And what that does is it just increases airflow over the heat sinks. So now all I'm left to do is put everything back together again and test it out. So everything's back together again now, and it's all running great. I've got it all hooked up. You can see I'm playing some Bayonetta there. It's all running perfectly fine. So what I'll do is I'll run this for a few hours tonight, and then again the next day, and then again the day after, just until I'm satisfied that it's all running properly. And then after that I'll list it up for sale, and I will mention in the listing that it has been repaired previously. But yeah, hopefully I'll make a little bit of profit on it. I should be able to sell it for about £40 to £50, which is not bad considering I paid about 14 for it and I've spent about an hour maybe repairing it. So yeah, hopefully this has been interesting to some of you. I've got more consoles on the way to fix, so I've actually got another series coming up right after this one if you want to check that out. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you again soon.